Hi everyone! Today I'm going to be doing a video about my favorite tropes in fiction. I've had this idea for a little while and I really wanted to do a video about it because it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately. Like, what are my favorite tropes that I find in stories? I think there are a lot of things that will just make me more likely to like a story if it has a certain trope in it, so I thought this would be a fun idea and hopefully you guys will enjoy it. The first one I want to talk about is totally a classic in a lot of genres of fiction, I think, and that's the school story. I've always really enjoyed things that are set at school. Usually this is some kind of boarding school. Ironically, I'm actually not a huge Harry Potter fan. I enjoyed Harry Potter when I was younger. I still like Harry Potter, but it was never something that I was a huge fan of. But definitely the school component is something that I do like about Harry Potter. There's just something kind of magical to me about those kind of boarding school stories. Maybe it's because I grew up in a small town going to public school, and there's just something about this image of getting whisked away to a school somewhere. It's almost like some kind of portal fantasy where the characters end up in another world completely and you get to explore that with them. I think there's something about the way the sort of rules and classes and just how the school works that I found very fascinating and also just appealed to the sense of order in me. So obviously I never had that experience of getting to go to some kind of magical or non-magical boarding school, but an experience I did have growing up was, as a musician, I would go to summer camp for classical music, which I think is a very common experience for people that are musicians. And going there, it was a very magical place in its own way, and it was a place where I got to meet a lot of other kids who had the same sort of interests and background that I did in a way that I didn't really get during the year, and I got to play music with them. That kind of like transporting, transformative experience really affected me, so I'm sure that also is kind of something that makes this trope appeal to me a lot. I'll try to just give a couple of examples for each trope of books that I can think of that sort of fit that trope, that are usually books that I like. I feel like thinking of examples for this kind of thing becomes really hard for me, even though I can tell you what I like. It's the same as, I don't know if any of you guys have this, when people ask me what books I like, even though I talk about books all the time, my mind will suddenly go blank. And sometimes when I'm trying to think of specific examples for things, I have kind of the same experience. I'll think, I know I've read a million books like that, but suddenly I can't think of any. But a few that do come to mind for this school story trope, I used to really like Ender's Game and Ender's Shadow. I haven't read either of them in quite a few years, but they were favorite books of mine, especially as a teenager. The school theme is obviously a really big thing in Ender's Game. Ender goes to battle school and gets drawn into this completely different world from his childhood. The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss is also a book that kind of fits this school trope. It's a college, kind of. I mean, Kavoth is younger when he goes to the school, but it's called the university, so, you know, obviously it's not a high school setting, but I still really like that aspect of the story when he first arrives there and has to learn how everything works. Another example is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. A lot of people complained that the first part of the story was kind of too conventional and predictable before the book then takes a turn and becomes incredibly dark and traumatizing. I really liked The Poppy War and its sequel, but I actually really liked the school element of the story, even though that is sort of the more classic conventional fantasy aspect of it. I'm sure there are a lot of other examples of magical or non-magical school stories. I think for me, for it to be really good, I don't mind if it's dark. It doesn't have to be like the school is a great place, but I don't want it to be too inherently messed up. I want there to be something about it that works instead of just being a terrible environment. And I really enjoy getting to actually spend some time at the school, see how things work, learn the rules. I don't want it to be something that gets glossed over too quickly. So for me, that's a trope that I really enjoy, and that's kind of how I like it to go. For number two, I don't know if this quite counts as a trope, but I've noticed, especially as I've been doing more book reviews and doing lists of books that I like, I really do like books that are funny, but it's a particular kind of humor. I like things that are sort of dark humor and tend to be kind of self-aware, maybe kind of self-referential humor, but I don't like things that are just purely slapstick or comedic. It was kind of a revelation to me in the last couple of months that I like books that are funny, but when I said that to my husband, he looked at me like I was stupid and was like, of course you do, I've known that for years. A few of my favorite books that have the kind of humor that I like, I've mentioned Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman quite a few times in videos already, and it is one of my all-time favorite books. I do enjoy Terry Pratchett on his own, but I'm not a huge Discworld fan. I've read some Discworld books. I generally liked them. It's something I enjoy, but not necessarily a favorite. And I honestly haven't read that much Neil Gaiman. His books tend to be a little too messed up for me. At least American Gods was when I read it as a teenager. I was a little traumatized. But something, the way their humor combined, I thought was really funny. Something about the way their humor combined when they worked together just really worked for me. There were things in it that were quite silly, and also things in it that were sort of slightly dark comedy about human nature, and I really enjoyed that combination. Another book that I loved recently that for me the humor really worked was Gideon the Ninth. I've talked about this series quite a bit recently, so I won't go into it too much, but the main character's sense of humor and sort of use of humor as a coping mechanism really is what made the narrative voice work really well for me. A few other books that I find have that edge of humor that I really like without necessarily being books that are comedic. For me, the Vorkosigan Saga by Lois McMaster Bujold, which is probably my all-time favorite series. I think there's quite a bit of humor in it, even though the books are serious, but somehow I find myself just laughing while I'm reading them. It sort of has that right amount of humor in it. Connie Willis is one of my favorite authors. Her books, again, they're not completely funny, and some are funnier than others, but there's just sort of this element, this comedic element of human absurdity in them that I find really entertaining. The next trope that I really like, again, this one is maybe a little bit of a guilty pleasure, I'm not sure, and this applies pretty much just to fantasy and science fiction, but I have kind of a thing for immortal characters. When I was reading Lord of the Rings when I was younger, I was always super interested in the elves, especially characters like Elrond, who's obviously completely a side character, but if you read all the, the Silmarillion and all the additional writings, it's a character that has, several thousand years of history, and I always thought that was really interesting. Especially for me, I like seeing characters that are immortal interact with characters that are not immortal. A few other books that I like that have examples of immortal characters, I really like Dara from the David Budd trilogy. I mean, he's a character that I have very mixed feelings towards, as I think we're supposed to, but I found his character interesting and appealing. Without giving any spoilers, this is a trope that is very important to Gideon the Ninth and Harrow the Ninth as well, and I liked how it was handled in this series. I just don't want to say too much because it'll spoil basically everything. Something that I don't really like with immortal characters, I've never been a huge vampire person. Vampires can be done well. I've actually seen some very funny books with vampires, and also The Vampire Chronicles by Anne Rice, which predates the most recent few YA vampire crazes. I've read the first few books of that series. It gets pretty weird pretty fast, but I did like the vampires in the first few books. But in general, I've never been a huge vampire person, but elves, I really like elves. Something else that I'm not sure if it quite counts as a trope, but I really like immersive world building and complex magic systems, and to me, those two things kind of go together. I think obviously you can have a really immersive world that doesn't have a fully explained or hard magic system, but the combination of those two things are something I really like. Obviously, Brandon Sanderson would kind of be the king of this, which is probably one of the reasons why I like his books so much. But some other fantasy authors I feel like did this really well. I'm not necessarily a total fan of Brent Weeks and the Lightbringer series, but I feel like the magic system and world building was really well done. And I think it's something, if you compare how Brent Weeks did with the world building from his first series to Lightbringer, it improved so much that I'm really excited to see what he writes in the future. Again, I have mixed feelings about the series, but I thought Foundry Side by Robert Jackson Bennett had a really great world and magic system. I didn't love Shorefall, which was book 2, but still I really like how the world and the magic and all of those things were handled. My issues with book 2 were actually more sort of character and plot issues. Again, I don't know if I can kind of include this as part of a trope, but I love worlds that have a steep learning curve, which is something that some people hate. But I absolutely love when I don't understand what's happening for the first half of the book because I just don't understand the specialized vocabulary and everything that the author is doing, but that I slowly gather this feeling of gaining fluency until suddenly you hit this point where like, oh, I completely understand everything and I feel really rewarded because I worked hard to understand what was happening, but now I know something I didn't know before. So to me, that's really exciting. I don't really like to travel all that much, so this is probably my substitute. In terms of, I don't actually spend a lot of time going to other countries and learning other languages because I'm a little too shy for that. So, I get to do it in books instead. But this is one of the things I really liked about Anathem by Neil Stephenson. It is a lot of work. He uses a lot of made up words and things like that, but it is very logical. And by the end, I felt like I'd been on this complete journey. I also have been really enjoying the works of Anne Leckie, her science fiction books and her one fantasy standalone. She has kind of a similar thing where she doesn't really pull any punches with the writing style and the world building, and you do just get completely dropped into something very alien, but then it feels kind of very rewarding when you get to understand it. The next few tropes are going to be a little less serious. I really like pirates or just naval fiction in general. I did read some of the Hornblower books when I was younger and Master and Commander and stuff like that, but when you put it in fantasy, it's just even better. I really like the Temeraire series by Naomi Novik, which is basically, Master and Commander, but with dragons. I can't really call that pirates, but it does have that kind of naval feeling. One of my favorite books, one of the first books I remember reading even, was Treasure Island, so obviously that's full of pirates. Maybe that's why I still kind of like pirates. I don't remember it too well because it has been a lot of years, but Robin Hobb's Live Ship trilogy, which is her second trilogy in her overall Farseer series, I still remember that as being one of the most creative and original fantasy trilogies and settings that I've ever read, and I kind of would like to revisit it at some point. Also, the second book in the Gentleman Bastards series, I'm scared to say the name right now because the first one is The Lies of Lamora, and that I'm sure about, but I'm sort of forgetting the title of book 2. I think it's Red Seas Under Red Skies, but please don't come after me if I got that wrong. Anyway, there are some pirates and ships in that book, and so I really enjoyed that aspect of book 2. Then kind of going along with pirates, I kind of want to throw just musketeers and anything basically swashbuckling. I'll just throw that under a trope as well. The Three Musketeers was one of my favorite books growing up. I still really love it. I'll watch any movie or read anything that references the Three Musketeers. I've mentioned that before. So if you have characters that are being heroic and fencing, having adventures, I'm all about that. I will read anything basically that has that, even if it's not good. My next trope that I'd like to talk about is one that my husband actually argued with me about when I told him, because I told him about this list and I said I really like slow burn romance, and he reminded me that generally I don't like romance, which is very true. Most of my favorite books do not have a strong romantic element, or that isn't a major plot, and there are not a lot of romances and relationships in fiction that I really like. I don't actively dislike it, it's just not something that really matters to me that much when I'm reading. When I find a romance that is done really well in a way that I like, that is something that I really like, so I want to put this on a list of tropes that I like. It's just that there are probably very few examples of it done in a way that actually appeal to me. I know I already mentioned the Vorkosigan Saga by Lois McMaster Bujold. There are 2 main romances in that series, although there are a bunch of secondary ones as well that I really like. The first one is in the prequel books with the main character's parents, and I love the fact that they are, first of all, they're already middle-aged when they meet, or, in their 30s and 40s, which as I approach my 30s, that doesn't seem so old anymore compared to how it did when I was 20 and I first read the book. But anyway, I really like a slow romance but not one that's very will they, won't they. Maybe one where characters are genuinely kept apart by their own other life goals or just where they are as people in their lives so far, and that they gradually come together and come to respect each other. For me, that's what a slow burn romance is, one where their mutual love and respect gradually grows until the relationship kind of becomes inevitable and they're just drawn together really powerfully into a very strong lifelong relationship. When we as readers get to actually see that relationship or that marriage, going into the future after they get together, that makes it even better. So that's what I really like to see in a relationship. It doesn't really matter to me. It can be enemies to lovers, it can be friends to lovers. I don't really care so much about that, but what I want to see is for it to develop in this slow, believable way. Honestly, some of the best examples that I could think of for this trope are also things that are not from fantasy. I guess maybe there aren't that many good fantasy romances, but a few that I thought of. I mean, Pride and Prejudice is a book that I love. To me, it's not really a will they, won't they at all. It's just the two characters need to both grow and learn from each other and get to the point where they have both changed to the point that they can be together. Also, when I was just thinking about this, I remembered the Lord Peter Wimsey series by Dorothy Sayers, which is a pretty old, classic kind of gentleman detective mystery series. I have a real fondness for mysteries, although it's not something I've talked too much about on this channel so far. In that series, Lord Peter originally rescues Harriet Vane from being convicted for a murder in one of the earlier books in the series, and he kind of falls in love with her, and she is just not interested in him, and it takes a lot of books for them to get together, but it is this very slow thing where she gradually comes to sort of know and respect him more, and he is, persistent but polite. He knows that he likes her, but he still also has to change and grow as a person as well before they can get together. And then there's a final book in the series after they're together, which also deals with their new marriage, and he's dealing with PTSD, and she has to kind of get to know him in a different way as well. And this is all in sort of a classic mystery series. So that's an example I really like. I think there are some other examples in mystery series that I like as well, because a lot of times there is a central couple or something like that. So what I don't like, obviously, I don't think anyone really likes insta-love. Maybe somebody does, I don't know. But that's not so great for me. I also don't like that thing you see, especially in TV shows, where the characters are going to get together, they spend a whole season getting together, and then at the end, the writers just don't know what to do, so they break them up, and you're going to spend the next 5 seasons of them trying to get together again. That's really annoying. That's not the kind of slow burn that I like. The last trope that I want to talk about, hopefully this one is also a trope, I feel like a lot of my tropes might not actually be tropes, is complex character motivations. Something I remember noticing as a younger reader that really, really bothered me is I felt that a lot of characters, but particularly female characters, never really got to have very complex motivations for why they were doing what they were doing. So while I felt like men usually got more complex or interesting reasons for why they were doing what they were doing, whether it was in fantasy or historical fiction or some other genre, I felt like women always were doing things because of their relationship with another character, whether it was for revenge or to try to save a family member or whatever. It was always because of some relationship with a parent or sibling or a romantic relationship. They were never doing things just as people because they had their own reasons to want to. This is something that I feel like has improved a lot in the last 15 years. I feel like I can't complain about it the way I did when I was a teenager, but it's still something that's really important to me to see women that have real complex reasons for doing things. I also like when men have real complex reasons for doing things, so, in general. But to me, it was something in the way that people were writing women in particular that really bothered me. And I remember talking to my mom, who's a writer, about this when I was probably in my late teens, maybe I was in college, and she recommended a book to me called Restless by William Boyd. It's actually a spy novel set during World War II with a half Russian woman who starts working for British intelligence. And It's a really good book. I haven't read it in quite a few years, but it does have a female lead character who does have a few family reasons why she gets involved in espionage, but also is basically just a very fully realized character that has her own desires and reasons for what she's doing. I'm sure I have other examples of female characters too, but that was just a book that really helped, I guess, give me that kind of complex character motivations that I was looking for at a time when I was complaining about it a lot, so I wanted to mention that book. So these were a few of my favorite tropes. I feel like some of them were more actual tropes than others, but hopefully this helps you get to know me and my reading taste better and the things that I like. Some of these were quite silly and others were more serious, but I think we all have those things where something will make us like a book more, even if we think the book isn't that great, because it's just something we like to read about. So I feel like I'm just becoming even more aware of what those things are, but I think it's good. I mean, we all read for fun, right? So if something helps us enjoy a book more, then, why not lean into it? So let me know down in the comments if you have any recommendations of books that really fit one or more of these tropes. And I'm also curious if you guys have thought about what are the things that you like to see in books that will make you maybe like a book that you might have otherwise not liked as much. Hope this video was fun. It was definitely interesting for me to think about all of these things. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more videos from me.